Hello, once again, this is Brother Teacher. I'll probably do more than one video on this particular brief subject of knowing uh, and applying what you know. So I'll begin in this particular video talking about martial arts. You know, depending on where you come from, who your instructors were or are, and what the art was that you studied, when you studied it, how you studied it, you may or may not know how to fight if it came down to it, or fight well if it came down to it. All of this depends solely, in most instances, on the individual. It is very, very important to know what you're doing when it comes down to it. So often I've seen people over the past, I say 30 years, maybe even longer, during the Bruce Lee era, thinking that they knew karate just simply because they watched the video. More often nowadays, within the past decade or so, since YouTube, this kind of thing, a lot of people will watch videos who have never studied the art of pugilism or fighting ever in their lives, and maybe have not even had a physical confrontation with anyone. Not that you should, and hopefully we will try to avoid confrontations if at all possible. But if peradventure you had to defend yourself, you need to know what you're doing, and what you're doing has to be predicated or based on real fighting, and not simply something that you copy. Should you have a reputable instructor? Most definitely, you should. If one is not available to you, videos and books can help, coupled with the reality of you being someone who understands, who has a sound understanding, I should say, of what fighting is, and not being disillusioned by what you're learning or looking at. It has to do with your temperament, again, and how you were raised, maybe even by your parents or whoever raised you. That's going to be the determining factor, and your will to live and survive is going to play into that as well. So it can be effective watching videos. Now, if you are someone who has already had an instructor and you're watching videos, all that does really is just add to what you already know, because you have the basics and or fundamentals. So, knowing. There's an expression that Bruce Lee used. Knowing is not enough. You must apply. Willing is not enough. You must do. So, he didn't create that statement or those statements. This has always been a reality as it relates to knowing and being able to apply. So, I'm a firm believer of the same. I remember when I was coming up earlier in my martial arts life and or career, that we were taught, this is me, at some school, some particular school, katas or forms. Now, some of the instructors knew the practical application. In Japanese Okinawan, they call it bunkai. What's the meaning of that thing? How does it apply to a real fight? So, some knew practical application and some did not. That's a fact. And I thought this was amazing as I got older and I was no longer a preteen or teenager, because you don't know what you don't know sometimes when you're really young. But I thought this was odd when I got into my adult ages, that these things that I was learning in the kata, even though they were legitimate techniques, but it was not broken down to us the way that it should have been broken down to us as far as the practical application of those same things. But I did learn those eventually. I did pick up those things eventually and understand how they apply. But I go back again to what I said earlier. It depends on the person. What's really strange to me is that you have people who have been in the martial arts for many years, who have obtained the rank of black belt and even master. Number one, some of them don't know how to fight effectively. Two, add to that, some of them don't know how the things that they've learned in the kata actually can benefit them in a fight and or street confrontation. And even some of the kata, depending on what the system and or style is that you're studying, depending on what it is, it may not be applicable in today's society, because the time in which it was created was hundreds of years ago, or even thousands of years ago. Not to say that it's not effective as it relates to martial arts on a practical standpoint, but there are some things that are purely ornamental in some katas or forms. Some things are just traditional. Some things don't exist anymore because they were designed for that time, the 14th, 15th, 16th century, if you will, for example. And the 20th and the 21st century, they don't apply anymore, or they can't be applied. But the basics, the physics of those arts still work. Stance, posture, breathing, acceleration, mass times acceleration equals power. You follow in centrifugal force and centripetal force and gravity and balance and using levers and things like this. A lot of these arts use those principles and or those physics, and we still use those today. But we have to learn in today's society that we have to adapt to how our world is that we live in today. Get what I'm saying? So now, are you running katas forms that are outdated for the 20th and 21st century, where we are today? Now, are you able to extract the things from those katas, in other words, that are beneficial for today and exclude the rest? Now, if you want to keep the kata alive just for history and traditional purposes, just to keep the art alive, I get it. There's nothing wrong with that. But still understand the practical aspect of those techniques. If it doesn't work today, you don't need it. If it does work, you grasp hold of it and you apply it today. Is that fair? Does that sound right to you? It should. Now, there were some times, many, many years ago, when some of these arts were created, there were men who were spearmen. You had those people who were spearmen. You had people who were archers who used bow and arrows, people who used swords, and people who used what we call staffs or bow staffs, and knives, and krisses, if you will, and various other types of what we consider exotic types of weapons during those particular eras. We don't live in those days anymore. You don't have buccaneers and swordsmen and archers in today's society. People use guns today. They use hammers. They use knives. I've seen some interesting stories here in the news of late where people have been murdered by a knife. So these are the modern day times. And guns. This is a gun culture. And so when you learn self-defense, it has to be predicated on that which makes sense for today's society. And I consider self-defense even being a person who's adapted using a gun in today's society. That's martial arts as well. The word martial means war arts. So when we talk about self-defense today, notwithstanding the situations with guns, we don't want to go around like the Wild Wild West shooting up the town and killing a bunch of folks with guns, even though that's the world we live in today for the most part. But as far as mano a mano, or a man taking care of himself against another man physically, just hands, if you will, and maybe small weapons or smaller weapons, handheld weapons, we should be able to protect ourselves pretty efficiently or effectively. And you don't have to be the greatest knife person in the world or the greatest martial artist, hand-to-hand combat person in the world, but you at least need to know the fundamentals of how to protect yourself. I didn't say fight. Note that I said protect yourself, even hand-to-hand. Protecting yourself doesn't necessarily mean that you are a very outstanding boxer or brawler per se, because a lot of people have been spewing this misinformation out here about fighting. You have to be this type of fighter to be a great martial artist or person to protect yourself. That means you have to equip every citizen in the world, every citizen in your society or inside your city or inside of your community with these spectacular, extraordinary martial arts skills. It doesn't work that way. The fundamentals is what we need to be focusing on. How to stand, how to breathe, the proper way to position yourself in a potential situation, and what's your tools that you're using. Hand, knee, elbows, even the head, but if you have to, how to claw someone, how to gouge, how to chop, knife hands, if you will, things of this nature. You teach this to the people in regular society. And then also, is there a way to teach an elderly person who doesn't have the agility that they once did? You have to learn how to teach an elderly person how to protect themselves if they don't have weapons, extended weapons, if you will, extension of hand, meaning a club or something like that. So what does an elderly person do if they are accosted by someone? Do they just stop and scream for help? That's what you do. So I hope this was something to get you to think. My whole point in this video is this: anyone can be deceived or misled by watching something and just copying it by rote. It is a totally different thing when it comes down to real fighting. It's not rehearsed. It's not theater. It's someone touching you. Now, also, before I close on this note, let me let you know this. If you're in a confrontation, take a deep breath and realize that you will get hit. I don't care how skilled you are or how well you throw a particular technique. Don't assume that that other person is not skilled. Even if it's not something that they practiced for years, if it's just simply a street fighter, ordinary guy or a woman off the street, don't assume that you won't get touched because you've been practicing. You must realize that this is part of fighting. You might get touched. You might get hit in the eye, the nose, and the mouth. You might get grappled to the ground. Understand that just because you're studying something or practicing something, a particular martial arts discipline or just simply self-defense, don't think that you're untouchable. But the thing is, you can minimize the damage. You can minimize your injury if you practice as close to reality as possible all the time. Put your heart in it, what you're doing. Be diligent in your training as well. And chances of your survival are greater. And I'm going to say this again before I close, and it's a little redundant. For those karate people that are learning forms, katas, pumps, hungs, whatever you want to call them, who go out on those floors in gymnasiums and auditoriums and you're doing karate tournaments and you're competing, don't be fooled. Don't try to fake the funk. Your kata's not what's beating the person in a potential street fight if you don't understand the practical side of fighting. Anybody can look flashy in a karate tournament. You can do flips and rolls and what have you and good punches, and you can yell real loud. It's different in the street. So make sure that you understand how your form works and that you can apply those basics and or fundamentals in those forms in a street confrontation if it comes down to it. And don't forget that some things are ceremonial, some things are traditional in those forms, some things are given are done in those forms in tribute to the master that created it. Some forms have been modified. Understand that. Get what's for you and spit out everything else that's not when it comes to fighting. This is Brother Teacher Grandmaster Stroud. Take care. Have a great day.